So now I'll be turning it over to our first guests. I'll be bringing out Ruben Harris. Ruben is the CEO of Career Karma, which is the platform for online job training, career coaching, and peer mentorship, helping people upskill and switch careers in the tech industry. And Ruben is going to be joined on stage by Freada Kapor Klein and Mitch Kapor, partners of Kapor Capital, which is a venture capital firm investing in early-stage startups with a focus on creating a more fair, just, and equitable society for low-income communities and underrepresented communities of color. We're really excited to have them here. They're also the authors of Closing the Equity Gap, a book about the intersection of wealth creation and fostering justice in venture capital. And they'll also be doing a book signing after this downstairs on level 1 at Julia's Books and Brew. That'll be at 2:30. So if you enjoy the conversation, you want to keep it going, please join them for that after this. All right, without further ado, here for a conversation about closing the equity gap, please welcome Ruben, Freada, and Mitch.
First of all, can we please put our hands together for the ASU+GSV team for putting this amazing event together? Yes. I'm honored to be on stage here with the great Freada and Mitch Kapor, who need no introduction, but I'm going to try to do my best. Freada and Mitch have contributed a lot from an investment perspective. How many investors do we have in the room? Please raise your hands. Amazing. They've contributed a lot from an education perspective. How many educators do we have in the room? That's what's up. They've contributed a lot from a philanthropic perspective. How many philanthropists and nonprofits do we have in the room? I see you guys. And they've contributed a lot from an impact perspective as well. So let's put our hands together for ourselves. Yes. As Chris mentioned, we're going to get into a conversation about their book called Closing the Equity Gap. But before getting into that, I want to set the stage because they've made a lot of contributions that I want to call out to the tech and education ecosystem. So Mitch is the founder of Lotus, where Freada also worked, and Lotus 123 was widely recognized as the killer app which made computers ubiquitous in business. As they were refining their Closing the Equity Gap strategy, they were early investors in companies like Angelus, Twilio, Asana, and Uber. After starting Kapor Capital, they continued to refine their Closing the Equity Gap strategy, invested in education technology companies like Clever, Newzella, ClassDojo, Bitwise, SV Academy, and Career Karma. And finally, as values-aligned investors, Freada co-founded the first group on sexual harassment in the US. Mitch is the co-founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation to help prepare us for cybersecurity challenges and ethical considerations introduced from AI. He's the founding chair of the Mozilla Foundation, and together they're leveling the playing field through a STEM education program for high school students of color called SMASH, founded 20 years ago and leveraging the Kapor Foundation to power Career Karma's Reskill America program, in addition to many other things. So I'm really excited about this conversation. Before transitioning to the next part of our conversation, I'll pause to say welcome, Mitch and Freada.
Thank you.
Delighted to be here with Ruben.
Before getting into this, I want you guys to know that Mitch and Freada are going to share some gems with you. So if you guys are on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, anything like that, make sure that you guys tag, tweet, and share it out. And we're going to start off by saying the world has changed. Ever since COVID hit, it forced billions of students to go online. It forced companies to embrace remote work and hybrid work environments. It also forced companies to embrace skills-first hiring strategies, and it forced colleges to think about their admissions process in addition to short-term training as they embrace online learning. Many colleges are going test optional and dropping the requirement to have the SAT or ACT in their admissions process. And as investors start thinking about identifying future entrepreneurs, there are many ways to spot talent. Some people focus on college students like Y Combinator in the early days, and other accelerators focus on college dropouts, like programs that you all are familiar with. But overall, people are trying to identify qualities of talent and students that are going to make a big impact in this world. Today's conversation, as Chris mentioned, is focused on the qualities that Mitch and Freada have shared in their Closing the Equity Gap book to give you keys on what has led to their ability to spot future entrepreneurial talent so you can do it too. So the 3 qualities that we're going to talk about are, number 1, lived experience, 2, distance traveled, and 3, gap closing strategies. And before unpacking these qualities, can you tell us some of the specifics about financial success and Kapor Capital's internal rate of return.
Sure. So thank you so much, Ruben, for moderating this. Hello, everyone. When we do investing, we want to make the world a better place. We want to close gaps, but we are serious as investors. So 10 years ago, Freada nudging me hard to invest alongside our values, we did a set of experiments. If we went all in and only invested in companies closing gaps of access or opportunity for low-income communities, communities of color, how would we do? And the book documents the fact that this kind of impact investing is just not concessionary. We had top quartile returns, top 25% across all venture funds, regardless of their investment thesis. And by investing in great founders like Ruben and many others. And the book is a story of the great founders we've invested in, their life stories and how we pick them and the great things that they've done. But there is a bottom line here, and the bottom line is if you think investing for impact means giving up returns, our data says otherwise.
Yes. Interesting. So as we think about these three qualities, lived experience, distance traveled, and gap closing, which qualities matter you the most? And how does this also apply to admissions teams in post-secondary institutions?
That's a big question. So we've been talking about distance traveled for more than 20 years. First, in the context of education. In the context of starting, I co-founded a scholarship program for students of color at UC Berkeley. We then went on 20 years ago to found SMASH for high school students. What we've learned is that distance traveled, where one started in life, we're all accidents of birth. If you chose your parents, raise your hand. Okay, got that cleared up. We are all accidents of birth, and what zip code you start out in determines your chances. We want to reward those founders, those students who started far away from the ball field, not the ones that were born on third base. So we found that distance traveled is a much better predictor of success, persistence, resilience in founders and in students. So we don't care about pedigrees, and we were speaking at Harvard Business School a couple weeks ago. They wrote a case study about Kapor Capital, and I said to them, I'm really sorry about all that money you spent on your Harvard education because it doesn't count with us. We don't want your pedigree, we want your distance traveled.
Awesome. Yeah. And in the spirit of distance traveled and zip codes, I know people travel here from all over the world. In the book, you talk about this concept of underestimated cities and how genius is evenly distributed across zip codes, but access and opportunity are not. Can you unpack that for us a little bit, and how does that fit into your bullseye company concept?
Sure. So it's been a favorite saying of mine, genius or talent evenly distributed by zip code, opportunity is not. And interestingly, I didn't realize it was such a highly charged statement, but when we started promoting the book on Twitter, a month or so ago, Elon Musk took me on and let his hordes loose on me. And it was surprising that there isn't a shared understanding. But our experience is that talent is everywhere and that there are just barriers that prevent people from developing that talent. So we have a company called Bitwise Industries, two great founders, Jake Sobral and Irma Algoin, in the unlikely city of Fresno, California, not known as a tech hotbed. But what they have done is they can take folks making $35,000 a year in the factory or farm or retail. They go through a paid apprenticeship program, paid, for a year and come out the other end making an average of $70,000 a year. That's doubling the salary. There'll be Salesforce administrators, there'll be JavaScript programmers. And it turns out that the barriers that have been preventing those folks from rising up have nothing to do with their talent. It has to do with the practicalities of, do they have childcare so they can, go to work? Do they have transportation? Is there food security? And when your program reflects that, this underestimated and overlooked talent, whether it's in Fresno or Buffalo or Las Cruces, New Mexico, or Cheyenne or any number of other cities, can really blossom. And Bitwise runs, I think, the largest tech apprenticeship set of programs in the U.S., and they're a perfect example of a company that is developing this talent, which is everywhere.
Yeah, and in the book
You can read about them in the book. They're totally inspiring people.
Yeah, absolutely. Shout out to Bitwise. And in the book, you also talk about how education, learning, and training can inherently change a person's position in life. Can you talk about that and how employers should be thinking about this? I know we got employers in the house too.
Well, we've seen this from our scholarship programs, and again, it's very similar to the philosophy that Mitch described in Bitwise. Each of these scholarship programs, whether it's at UC Berkeley or at the 10 campuses where SMASH exists, they focus on removing the barriers that never should have been there in the first place, and to let the students thrive. And that's what employers need to duplicate. Employers need to think about a distance-traveled philosophy for resume review instead of a pedigree-focused approach. And I know, Ruben, that's what Career Karma is working with employers to find all of this great talent that's out there.
Yeah. And the next question might make people feel a little uncomfortable, but I think uncomfortable conversations are opportunities for us to get closer together. And since this is an EdTech conference, I want to talk about access and diversity. Because usually when you talk about dropping historical requirements for a degree, which a lot of employers are doing, or going test optional for SAT or SAT, people start having passionate debates about whether they're making financial concessions or decreasing the quality of our talent pool. Can you talk about that?
Well, sure. Look, I think that there is still, despite best intentions, there's still all kinds of systemic bias, systemic sexism, systemic racism, on and on. And it's all of our jobs to look at ourselves, hold up a mirror, and figure out where our biases get in the way of identifying talent, whether it's students or entrepreneurs, whether it gets in the way of building a welcoming culture in a workplace. Because, in case you haven't noticed, the demographics of this country are rapidly changing. Students of color have been the majority in public schools throughout the U.S. for many years now. And some states, like here in California, it's been, the gap is just growing wider and wider. And so our entrepreneurs with top quartile returns that Mitch talked about in our first 10 years, 60% underrepresented entrepreneurs.
60% underrepresented entrepreneurs, yes. Can you talk about distance travel, lived experience, and how it fits into founder or student mental health?
So let's talk for a minute about lived experience, because this is very important. We like to say that entrepreneurs tend to scratch their own itch. And what we have found for many of the founders we've invested in is that they have some particular piece of lived experience which was very formative for them, maybe very scarring in some sense. Like Donnell Baird of Block Power grew up in Bedford-Stuyvesant, and the way the family stayed warm during the winter was to keep the oven open, because they had to. Not safe, not healthy. Donnell's company, Block Power, is working at scale to decarbonize, in other words, turn to completely renewable sources of energy for heating and cooling, especially in buildings in the urban core. So he is taking his lived experience, which was the seed of something, and then turning it into a solution. So lived experience really matters a lot. But there is a mental health component also to be aware of. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, sure. I think when we talk about mental health and lived experience, we're talking about the trauma that a lot of young people are exposed to. And I'm sure many in this crowd are quite familiar with adverse childhood experiences, with that inventory, how many one is exposed to, change the trajectory of your life. So if we can interrupt those kinds of adverse childhood experiences, let me tell a quick story. And this was in the early days of SMASH. We would do hackathons on the weekend. We were running one in Oakland for middle school students. And we said, your job is to design an app that solves a real problem in your school or community. So one of the teams, they had to go out and do customer development for a couple of hours during the day, and there were real VCs judging it on Sunday. It was a great experience. One of the teams, and this has stuck with me for well over a decade, one of the teams, middle school kids, went to the Oakland police station, got real crime data. They took real crime data, layered it on top of Google Maps, and they said, we want to create an app that tells us every day which is the safest way to walk home and avoid the gangs who are fighting this afternoon. So if that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about the power of lived experience and how it generates innovation, but also middle school students should not be worrying about, am I going to get shot on the way home, let alone ringing the wrong doorbell.
So after George Floyd was murdered, our two younger black partners, who are now the co-managing partners of Kapor Capital, said, we need to do something. And one of the things they did was to engage some black therapists to have meetings both for our team and for the founders and for others, just to have a safer space to talk about what was going on, to help people process it. Because if you ask people to check themselves at the door to pretend that things that aren't affecting us deeply aren't, if we're saying, no, just do business here, that does not work. People flip out, they freak out, and so having a kind of mental health awareness and resources as part of the portfolio services of what a VC firm does, we think that's a best practice. We think people who don't do that are missing something.
Well, yeah. And one of the people interviewed in the book came from that scholarship program, the Ideal Scholars I mentioned, from UC Berkeley. He was in our first class, Dr. P.K. Farnsworth. He started life being left on a curb at age 10 months. He's now an MD, MBA. He's, give it up for PK. And he is, so I've known him since he was a high school senior. He's board certified in psychiatry, he's board certified in addiction psychiatry, he's bilingual in Spanish, and he's running a clinic in South Central LA focused on youth who had his same lived experience. So his lived experience propelled him. The scholarship program was put in place to counteract Prop 209 in California. Prop 209 killed affirmative action in public institutions. So after the students got in race blind, we created a race-conscious scholarship program. Dr. Farnsworth, I still think of him as a high school senior, Dr. Farnsworth would not be doing the work he's doing if we had not created that kind of pathway. He did all the work. I did not take one exam, but we have to think about how many PKs are out there who don't have that opportunity.
In closing, in the last 2 minutes that we have, there's something else that you said in the book that I want everybody to write down. It's intent barely matters, impact does. Intent barely matters, impact does. This is important because a lot of people here have their hearts in the right place, but what does this mean for them?
Well, I'll say one thing. Sometimes the problems of the world seem so overwhelming and you have some intent to do something. Start by holding up a mirror. Look in your own institution, whatever it is, and look who are the decision makers, who's sitting around the table. Does it really reflect the larger community or group or market that you're serving? Because if it doesn't, that is a correctable problem and is something you can start on right away. And it is much more important to start to do something that begins with a very honest self-assessment and taking small steps, because everyone, no matter what their situation is, can take small steps.
When I think I start by assuming everybody is well-intentioned. Might be a few people that don't fall in that category, but most of us are well-intentioned. That doesn't excuse the harm that we do unintentionally. And that's the impact we have to focus on. So we need to find ways to hear about our impact when we are not acting in the best way. There's a lot of performative nonsense that happened after George Floyd was murdered. The nearly $50 billion that was pledged, half of 1% can be accounted for actually being spent. That's the difference between intent and impact.
Say that one more time.
50 billion, the Washington Post has this analysis. Nearly 50 billion was pledged, 0.5% was actually funded.
And we're at time. Mitch and Freada Kapor. Check out the book. It's going down. It's amazing. Thank you all.
Thank you.